Hello everyone and welcome to another interview on this channel. Today I would like to present an interview I did recently with Professor Dagmar Wujastyk. I hope you find the following talk of interest. Okay, so we're going to, just before we start actually, I better just give some background on how I know Dagmar. It's a kind of a little bit of a convoluted tale and I'll try to compress it as much as I can. And it's a strange tale as well because I was in Japan and I was talking to an author there who specialized in books on Japanese alchemy. And I was just doing a little bit of background work for my book at the time and just kind of compiling some extra notes. And he said, you know, there's a guy in Osaka you should speak to, an Indian gentleman who's also interested in this subject, who'd be really helpful for you. So I got on a train, went to Osaka. I met this Indian gentleman, and we spent about 2 hours sitting in a hotel foyer. And he was waving his book at me all the time and telling me about this book that he'd done, and complaining all the way. Well, not complaining, but lamenting that he wasn't able to complete it. He was missing some Sanskrit documents, and he insisted when I got back to the UK that I tracked down your husband, Dominic. And after a sort of series of emails, we kind of, I think he wasn't really sure where I was coming from and I didn't really know what I was asking, but we kind of found a sort of a middle ground. And he said, so what you really need to know is more about kind of Rasa Shastra. He said, well, so you need to speak to my wife, Dagmar. She's the expert on that. And then that's kind of how I found you. And then we had sort of a brief conversations backwards and forwards with emails, probably over a year. And then sort of fast forward to it was 2016 now, was it? Was it that long ago in Vienna?
Even, yeah, 2015.
Vienna. So you asked me to come and do a talk on Rasa Shastra, and weirdly a practical as well, which was really quite fun, in front of sort of presenting to your students and teachers that were there to give there was a symposium at the time. And then we just sort of stayed in contact. And then after that, we got involved in working together on a project where I was doing the sort of practical work and you were doing the sort of translating as well. And I'm sure you'll go into more detail about that. I think the most important thing I wanted to say was, for me, it's been really fantastic because my background is very practical and I read very little, or as little as I can get away with. So to have somebody that could actually read the original text and was able to translate this work and indeed specializes in this kind of work was really fantastic for me. And I've learned so much through kind of our interactions and you discussing these things, and kind of it's made it much clearer for me. It's kind of made the whole subject much bigger than it was before. You know, before I was kind of, you know, I shied away from all the sort of Sanskrit and the technical side of it. I was just purely a hands-on practical person, but it's kind of really enkindled my interest in that side of the study. So without further ado, I think it's better I just let Dagmar explain who she is and a little bit about her background, how she got into this. I'm sure it'll be a fascinating story. So over to you, Dagmar.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I think of our meeting as a sort of stroke of luck for me also, you know, as I'm a philologist. Well, by training, I'm an Indologist, so somebody who studies the languages and cultures of ancient or pre-modern India. And so I usually just work with texts. But I think, you know, with the sort of areas of specialization that I've worked on, which was medicine and then later alchemy, you know, these are disciplines that have a life that continues on to today. And it's just really interesting to see how something that was written or composed, you know, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, how that can be brought to life. And it's been really nice to see you recreating some of the recipes and sort of getting a sense of the materials and what that might look like and so on. So it's been, yeah, I've really loved collaborating with you, and it's really brought the whole thing to life for me. You know, I'm sort of, I think about texts a lot and you know, sort of how they were used and why they were used, and sort of recreating things with you has given me so many insights that I never would have been able to have without your work on these things. And I got to say, I also so appreciate the sort of your sense of aesthetics that you brought into, you know, filming, documenting the experiments and so on. That's really heightened everything for me. And I think also, you know, the audiences have really appreciated it. You mentioned that symposium that you came to. You know, I think that must have been the favorite thing for everybody joining that symposium.
It was fun. It was fun.
Everybody just loved it. You know, this was a room full of people who only ever work with texts. And then to see these things come alive, you know, that was really fascinating for everyone. So thank you so much for joining that at the time. And I mean, yeah, as I said, by training, I'm an Indologist. I studied at Bonn University, and, the kind of things that we would do, this was, really the study of Indology. We would be mostly learning how to read Sanskrit, how to translate Sanskrit, and also Middle Indo-European languages like Pali, for example. You could do modern languages. I didn't do much of that. So I really concentrated on Sanskrit, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, and so on, and Pali. And, so I started getting interested in medicine, and I wrote my MA thesis on, it was a translation of a chapter from the 7th century work on medicine, the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, the Heart of Medicine by Vagbhata, was a chapter on conception and birth. And that really sort of sparked my interest in Indian medicine. So I'd never heard of sort of Ayurveda before, right? That was just not really, it's not really a classical part of, Indology. You're reading religious texts a lot and so on, you're reading poetry, things like that. So, but it happened to be the case that my professor, my supervisor, Klaus Vogel, he had a specialization in the history of medicine. So, and he was both a Sanskritist and a Tibetanist. So he worked on this medical work, the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, both in its Tibetan version and the Sanskrit version. So he was a good person to work with for the MA. And, that's how it started for me.
So what particularly, I mean, you don't kind of wake up one morning and suddenly think, right, I want to study Indian alchemy. That's a very specialized field within or an already specialized field. So what was it that kind of first alerted you to that in the text, and you thought, actually, that's something I'd like to know more about?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, after my MA, I did a PhD again on Indian medicine. And so I really got into the history of Indian medicine and the textual corpus. But mostly when you work on Indian medicine, you start with like the oldest texts, right? You're working on Charaka, Sushruta, Vagbhata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, and so on. But while I was looking at these texts, and this was a work on medical ethics, then I sort of was thinking of how do the themes first presented in these works go forward into later works, works that were written after the 10th century. And I sort of got interested in that literature. And when I finished my PhD and my book for that on medical ethics and medical etiquette in Ayurveda, I was sort of thinking of changes in Ayurveda, so we have this long tradition where, everybody sort of feels like it's one thing and as if it's unchanging over the time. But when you look at the text, you can see quite a few changes, especially 10th century forward. And, one of these changes is the introduction of metals and minerals into Ayurveda. Now, metals are used before, even in the earliest texts we have, iron tonics and so on. Actually, we visited you and made some iron tonics according to this recipe. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But then there's this, there's a sort of introduction of mercury, for example, as a material, also a heightened use of toxic substances. And most of all, there's sort of a change in how these materials are dealt with. So basically, the new ideas that come in are this sort of idea of purification that you don't find in the older works. And, while I was looking at that and thinking, what brought in this change, this different way of thinking, I realized that a lot of these new recipes were sort of not exactly maybe derived, but they showed some sort of collaboration with a different genre of writing, and that was this alchemical writing. And I had never really dealt with alchemical texts before. It's a really fringe area within Indology. There's very few people who have worked on it. Mircea Eliade, wrote a little bit about it, but didn't do a lot of textual work. But then, of course, David Gordon White wrote The Alchemical Body. So that, that's like the most important work on the history of the alchemical tradition in India. He did some translation for that. It's a very good book. And, I would recommend it to anyone who sort of wants to understand the Indian alchemical tradition. My husband, Dominic Wujastyk, had written an article in the 80s about some misunderstandings about, different texts. That's an article called The Alchemical Ghost, and you can find it on academia.edu if you want to read up on that. So just not a lot of writing, but at the same time, we know that the alchemical tradition, or Rasa Shastra, Rasa Vidya, Rasa Vada, still exists today in India. You have training in it from Sri Lanka. And so, people are practicing it. There are textbooks. There are people who are using the texts, or translations of the text, paraphrases of the text, and so on. So I thought this would be a really worthwhile subject. And I thought it was really interesting, this sort of exchange with medicine. And then I kind of wanted to know, what other fields within Indic thought does alchemy connect with? And, yoga was one that sort of presented itself. So I started this big project funded by the European Research Council. And this was about, basically about the entangled histories of alchemy and medicine and yoga. We did that from 2015 to 2020. So that's just the period when you and I met and started working together.
Yeah. And what, just to give people a brief synopsis, obviously they can go to the website and go into some detail, but what was your conclusion about the sort of the way that those three sort of subjects were coming together? Just a sort of a brief overview.
I know I'm always, every time somebody asks me this, I'm like, oh no, how can I, there's so much to say. So, I mean, okay, if we do medicine and alchemy, they're intertwined right from the beginning. So even the earliest of the alchemical texts show a knowledge of Ayurvedic knowledge. And so alchemical texts, the early ones, they're very technical. They describe procedures for making a mercurial elixir. And then at the end, they describe a sort of regimen to apply that elixir, right? So before, you can maybe make gold or silver or so, and then you use that elixir and you apply it to the human being. And the description of what you need to do to take that elixir, because you can't just pop a pill, as it were, right? You prepare the body, and this takes a long time and so on. You purge yourself, all sorts of things. Now, if you compare that with Ayurvedic instructions from the earliest of the Ayurvedic texts on how to apply the so-called rasayanas, these sort of rejuvenation or longevity tonics, then it's really similar, down to the medicines that you're using for purging or for getting you to sweat and so on. So this whole sort of preparation for the elixir is very, very similar, so clearly derived from medicine. Right. And so there's this, they don't say do it like it's described in Charaka or Sushruta, but, actually, like step by step, it's very similar. And even sometimes in the goals. Now, the early medical texts don't use mercurial elixirs. They don't use mercury, right? They have different kinds of tonics, Chyawanprash and things like that. But they also feel like there's, you can live for a very long time if you take these tonics and so on. So then in the alchemical text, then you kind of become immortal or so. So it's a bit extended, let's say, but the goals of the thing is, also a liberative experience and so on. So that's not so much mentioned in the medical texts. But you can see this very, very clear, knowledge of medicine. There's also a 9th century medical text written by a Jain monk. And that might be like the very first text to mention these sort of apparatuses for making elixirs using mercury, and also the kind of the procedures that then become sort of typical for alchemy. And if it is really not like an added on chapter that might have been added later, then in a way we would have alchemy in medicine first. Right. So it's just a little bit, but there's, dating the texts and so on, being sure about when something was written or composed is always a bit tricky, right? So usually we think, these procedures first occur in these alchemical texts and then they're brought into medicine. But, there's probably like an entangled history where right from the beginning, these were people talking to each other. Right. So and then later we know that the alchemical texts kind of have a shift where they integrate more and more medicine. Right. So the early ones, while they have this sort of rasayana, this rejuvenation, longevity regimen that is Ayurvedic, they don't really talk about, treating cough or treating diseases or so, right? You become a superhuman who lives forever or something, but it doesn't really deal so much with disease. But the later ones do, starting really with the sort of from the 13th century, probably, right? So then more and more, it becomes more and more focused on medicine and less on liberation, immortality, and so on. And then you get works like the Rasindra, sorry, I can't remember the names right, but 16th century work where it's all medicine, right? So you have this sort of shift. So from, relying on medicine to some sense to basically becoming medicine. But then the difference is that the medicinal formulations in alchemical texts, they're all about minerals and metals and mercury and so on, which the Ayurvedic texts are not. They integrate some mercurials, they integrate metallic medicines more. But, let's say if against one disease you have 10 different medicines, maybe one or two of them will be these sort of metallic formulations, right? So they're still sort of separate, but with these sort of integrations of each other's ideas. So that's alchemy and medicine, right? That's quite a long thing to say already. But for yoga, it's a bit more complicated. So in the alchemical text, some alchemical texts talk of the alchemist and call the alchemist a yogi, right? So you're sort of like, it's yoga, right? There's a yogi. But that's probably actually just a sign of their connection with tantric thought and older tantric or agama texts, where the name of the practitioner can also sometimes be a yogi. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much the kind of yoga practitioner that you find in sort of hatha yoga texts, right? And when we looked at the sort of connections there, we found that there are some connections. So, for example, a text like the Kechari Vidya, which is a text translated by James Mallinson, for example. So I think you should be able to get access to it.
Yeah, I'll put the links up later, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the chapters of that work, which is a work on yoga, I think, 13th or 12th century or so, has a chapter which describes the use of sort of kalpas or rasayanas. So again, these are then longevity / immortality drugs, right? And these are, the kinds of formulations that you will find there are both connected with medicine and with alchemical thought. So you have, these procedures that you find in alchemical texts and so on, just briefly referred to. Now that chapter is a bit of an outlier in that work, and apparently it's lifted from another work that is older, namely the Matsyendra Samhita, and that is a tantric work. So we have basically the connection between alchemy and yoga goes via tantra. And we weren't really able to go much further than that. What we could say, and this was Suzanne Newcomb's research, she was sort of the one who in the Ayur Yoga project was looking at yoga more specifically, and she was looking at the modern era. She sort of noticed in the 20th century that the people who were still known for being able to access these kinds of treatments, elixir regimens, longevity treatments, and so on, that they were, yogis or sadhus. So people who had taken a spiritual path and so on, were spiritual teachers, and that those people were associated still with this kind of knowledge of how to make these elixirs and so on, right? So in the 20th century, we get this very strong connection between rasayana therapy and the more sort of alchemical elixirs and so on again. So that's another connection. But then we have a few hundred years in between where we don't exactly know what happened. And probably there's a shift there from, who are the users and what kind of texts are they producing, if any. And probably we should look at Persian literature. Right. And there, Fabrizio Speziale, who's in Paris, he has for many years been heading or working in the Perso-Indica project, and he has been looking a lot into sort of the Persian text created in India on the Indian subcontinent, that are medical using Ayurvedic knowledge, but also alchemical knowledge and so on. So I think that's, in our project, we couldn't totally pinpoint this, but that would be where one would probably have to look to find that sort of missing link between yoga, Ayurveda, and alchemy.
So is alchemy the kind of thread that runs through the whole thing? That in a way, in a weird way, they're all kind of connected to that, rather than kind of yoga and Ayurveda, which are not so much connected.
Yoga and Ayurveda are, are not as connected as we thought it would be. I mean, I had always thought, reading the Ayurvedic texts, I didn't see a lot of yoga in there, right? There are a few small things, in Charaka especially, but there's really no integration. So, for example, you will nowhere find in any medical text this thing where the doctor says, and you should go and practice yoga or something. That's just not, it's not a therapeutic intervention. It's not even part of dinacharya, so the daily regimen or so for a healthy life. But then in the 20th century we got this idea of yoga and Ayurveda as sister sciences, and I think with people like David Frawley, Robert Svoboda, and so on, sort of Vasant Blad, making this connection and showing them as sister sciences and sort of applying them as sister sciences. And, I think, while historically that doesn't seem to have been the case, it still makes sense to me.
It's a nice idea. It's a nice idea, isn't it? It sounds,
yeah. Yeah, and I could totally see, and there's been attempts to sort of have yoga practices that connect to the three doshas, the sort of humoral system, and so on. And I think people have had positive experiences with that. And it's these are all part of a continuum of Indic thought. So I wouldn't dismiss this connection. It's just that historically these were quite separate in terms of literature and the kinds of practices people were associated with, right? And this sort of what connection there was or not connection. There's a long article written by Jason Birch, who was also on my project, something like 80 pages or something. It's in the Journal of Yoga Studies. And there he looks at the connection between yoga and Ayurveda. And he sort of looked at he was looking at sort of Hatha yoga literatures and medieval literature, and sort of, taking out any instances where there was any sort of medical vocabulary or so, or where there's any mention of any kind of medical practice or yoga being practiced for health and so on. And he sort of says, yes, while they're using Ayurvedic terminology, but it would be like, if I say I have a headache, you would know what I mean without either of us having any medical training, right? And these ideas of, the humors, and what are the great elements in the world and so on, that would have been sort of pan-Indic knowledge or an understanding of the world. So that's the point that he makes. It doesn't, using such terminology doesn't make something Ayurvedic, is his point. I think, one can debate, to what degree one, allows for there to be a stronger connection or not. But, basically the research shows that there wasn't a very strong connection between the two genres. But now there is, so now I think, we can make that argument for the 20th century and certainly for the 21st.
So in terms of, what would you say would be the sort of golden age of when Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra were kind of working in tandem, where you could really say, if you were going to learn either, you'd be expected to have an understanding of the other? Or do you think that they very much kind of skirted around each other, and it's only fairly recently that they've been more integrated? Because you go to any Ayurvedic pharmacy in India and Sri Lanka, they'll have a small building which is dedicated to all the Rasa products, and they sort of keep all that separate. And you even feel that it's separate. It's kind of not always in the main building. It's always to one side, and it's a bit of an oddity. So, but when you look at if you get the Indian formulary guide, and you go through it. I mean, there's not many Ayurvedic preparations that don't have some Rasa ingredient in it. So it's quite prolific. So I just wondered, at what point were they kind of really meshed together, and we can say, yes, that's really part of the Ayurvedic tradition? And at what point was it still, or has it ever really been part of it? Could you say it's a kind of a tradition within a tradition, or I'm just trying to understand how they fit together, really.
It's really hard to say, because we have so few data on the actual lives of the practitioners, right? So, we kind of need reports from the outside, because the texts themselves don't really talk about how they work with each other, So you have you have an Ayurvedic work, and then you have Rasa Shastra formulae in it, and they don't say, and I talked to the neighboring specialist on Rasa Shastra, right? They don't tell you how they came to use this recipe. Sometimes they name the person who invented the recipe. So let's say Nagarjuna, this is Nagarjuna's wick or something like that, but they never tell you how they came to it. So my sense is, just from the literature, that they were sort of separate. So even there would be a Rasa Shastra medical practitioner, and there would be an Ayurvedic medical practitioner, and they would have different lineages of training. But having said that, when we then, we have sort of Rasa Shastra formulae in works like Chakrapani Datta's Chakradatta or Chikitsa Sangraha, that's 11th century, first sort of recipes, and then, Vangasena and so on integrates some to copper recipes and so on that you don't have in the older works. But it's really like there's a moment of change, I think, really with Shangadhara. So the Shangadhara Samhita is a work that dates to 12th, 13th century, maybe a little bit later. And that has 2 chapters that are sort of relevant there. And one is about the sort of cleansing of metals and minerals, and one is dedicated to mercury. And those are, these are really big parts of this work as a whole. And he sort of explains how to use these, how to prepare things, gives quite a lot of detail. And, so they're giving the same sort of weight as the herbal medicines and so on. And I would say that from then on, Rasa Shastra becomes an integrated part of the Ayurvedic tradition. So later works also have chapters on, the cleansing of metals and minerals and so on, like the Bhava Prakasha, which became a very famous work, 16th century, the Vaishajya Ratnavali, 18th and 19th century. They all have these kind of chapters, and they integrate things also from some other alchemical works. So then it becomes sort of mainstream, still a minor part of Ayurvedic medicine, but it's there and it's established and sort of agreed upon that these are efficient medicines.
I mean, it's quite extensive, isn't it? If you go through the modern formulary, and I look through the list, it's hard to find a recipe that doesn't have some alchemical ingredient, just be it something simple like cowrie shells or conch or something, but it's there, there all these ingredients appear. So it's...
But I mean, you call them alchemical ingredients, but you could also call them Ayurvedic ingredients, right? Because
exactly.
From the beginning, right? So I mean, what you could just say is, what ingredient wasn't there that then first appears in alchemical works and then comes into Ayurvedic ones, and that would be mercury. And maybe another one would be zinc.
Yeah.
So zinc doesn't really feature in medicine until it has been featured in alchemical works. And it's mostly about sort of the procedures used for purifying things. This whole idea of something being shuddha, right? Purified or fit for purpose, right? That idea, that concept, that's alchemical. And you don't have it in medical literature before alchemy. And then it's sort of introduced, that you need to treat materials. Because before, if you look at the older medical works, they, it's mostly herbal, but they go like, let's say there's a herb, and it's eaten by worms or something. You don't cleanse that material, you throw it away, you don't use it.
Yeah.
So now with metals and minerals, they say, okay, you can't use it as is, but you can purify it, and then you make it fit for purpose, and you use herbal materials to cleanse the metals and minerals. So you're, in a way, it's like the idea of using medicine for materials, not just for humans.
Right.
That's
that sort of metallic idea as well, isn't it? This idea of metals, because metals can be thrown back into the fire and reforged. You've almost got like this longevity, immortality kind of quality about them. So maybe they thought it's not practical to throw that away, because there's an inherent quality in metal that can be resurrected. So it's almost like they're sort of drawing on that idea, and the idea that the sort of preparation of mercury from cinnabar, when you heat it, you release the gas, and then you kind of condense it again and you end up with the red crystal. So you start with cinnabar and you kind of end with cinnabar. So there's a sort of cyclical process in there as well. So
Yeah, that's
maybe something like that. I'm not sure. So I just want to ask very quickly in Charaka and the older text, is it definitive now that the Mercury's actually in there? You can actually say that is a section which talks about Mercury. Or
yeah, it's really tricky. That's there are some passages where there's a mention of rasa, right? And rasa, can mean juice, sap, like you press a plant and the thing that comes out is rasa, right? It's the liquid, right? So, and I think in Sushruta, there's the use of the word sutara. So, but the context in which this is mentioned is a little bit, like in Sushruta, it's a very fascinating passage where it's about coating the strings of a musical instrument or the stringed instrument with the sutara, and then you play the music, and that then works against poisons. Right. So it's very different to, how mercury is, processed later in alchemical texts or for medicine, a very different thing for using it. Then there are uses of it, like in Bhagavata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, for example, you have the mention of it as a topical use of mercury, where I think it might be called parada at that point, and where you use it against lice. So you have head lice, and then you just put mercury on it, basically.
Wow.
And in Bhagavata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, so the 7th century work, there's one passage in the Rasayana section, so in this rejuvenation and longevity therapy section, in which parada is mentioned as a thing with which you can restore the body. And it's not really a recipe, it's a list of sort of wholesome ingredients that will let you fill up the body again, like the moon fills, within the, in the bright part of the month. So that's like one sentence, and where, this is sort of about, the internal use of parada. It's a bit of a non sequitur in that passage, right? It's sort of like what comes before, what comes after doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's this sentence you could just take that sentence out and it wouldn't hinder understanding the rest of the chapter, right? So, but that same sentence occurs in a different form in the Rasarnava, one of the oldest, classical alchemical texts. And in a context where it does make sense, but it's used slightly differently. So, so maybe somebody went and brought that sentence back into the text at a later stage. Maybe it was already there. And again, the alchemists were kind of using medical knowledge. It's really hard to say. One of the reasons is that the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita is the most popular medical text of any time. There are hundreds of thousands of manuscripts of this work. So for somebody to make like a critical edition, it's like nobody's going to
work.
Crazy, You think of, let's say the Sushruta project or so, we're talking, there's maybe several hundred of partial manuscripts or so, so like it's already too much work for a single person, but, you can kind of start thinking about, how these texts relate to each other. But with the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, you really cannot. And so, nobody is trying to make a critical edition. I mean, maybe if you found very old manuscripts or so, that would be worth your while to look at it and to see whether this sentence is in there or not. But it seems like a whole lot of work for, I don't know, what's the return to know, well, mercury was used internally in the 7th century. It may have been.
I mean, when I was studying, I know that all the tutors kind of tried to lean more towards Ashtanga, but the particular group that I was with, we started with Charaka. So it's the book I've always, I read it as a sort of dip-in book. For me, it's kind of just something I open and read bits and pieces in it. I mean, I did actually read it, the whole thing. This is the RK, there's a PV Sharma and there's an RK Sharma, isn't it? I've got the yellow one. There's a sort of 6.
That's the RK one, yeah.
Quite a lot of commentaries in it, which I found very useful. I mean, I don't know how good they are in terms of translation quality, but I mean, certainly got me through that initial time. And I remember I was always fascinated by book 3 with the stuck on the kind of rasayanas where they talk about the shilajits and the different types of amlaki, how you can mix it with pipali and all those. So I got really into that. But again, there's nothing really in there that you can really get your teeth into. It kind of, there's some simple recipes, there's some very convoluted recipes, there's complex recipes with things that can't even be identified. So it was a little bit frustrating from that point. One thing I wanted to ask you, which has kind of intrigued me, when I was working in hospitals and you were talking about Rasayana, or you went into the Rasa departments, they always said it's so important that before we do anything, the body has to be purified. We have to do PK, Panchakarma, the whole body must be purified. And they were likening PK is effectively the same that we would do to a mineral or a metal, like a sweating and steaming and boiling and bashing. And so it's a kind of panchakarma was like a shodhana for the human being before you were laying the seeds, or you were making the ground fertile before you
exactly.
seeds. So is there any connection between that? That's quite an old practice, isn't it? I mean, that is in Charaka. So
yeah, so not all Ayurvedic therapies seem to require like what we call panchakarma now. So sometimes you just have, bits of it rather than the whole thing, with or without oleation and so on in between. Panchakarma is sort of stands in itself as a kind of rasayana treatment, and can, sometimes it's in preparation for the rasayana treatment, and it's never like exactly laid out. You just know there's things that you would be made to sweat, and you're going to be oiled, and you're going to be treated like that. So it becomes, nowadays they've made this connection a bit more clearly, I would say. Yeah, and I like this sort of parallel between treating the human body like that and then treating the medicine like that, because that's you could see it. I mean, if you look at these sanskaras, these procedures for readying mercury for the elixir, it sort of starts off with rubbing, and then it goes on with sweating, making sweat swedana. I often had discussions about how to translate swedana. As I was recently giving a talk to my department here at the University of Alberta, and they're all historians. They don't really have anything to do with India, right? So so they're listening to this from a very different perspective. And I was just showing them some of the apparatuses used, images of the apparatuses. And I was showing them a dola yantra, right? So, a sweating device, so a hammock device, a swing device, for the dola being a hammock or something that swings, right? And I was sort of saying, this is for the procedure called sweating, svedana. And then one of them said, but that bolus is hanging in the liquid, so it's not actually being sweated, it's being steamed, it's being boiled. This is not steaming it. You're calling it steaming, but it's not being steamed, it's being boiled. And I say, okay, sometimes it says hang it above, sometimes it says hanging in, but it's true, you can't, making sweat steaming isn't quite right. But I kind of use the steaming, I think, because there is this parallel to the panchakarma, right, where you have this steaming. Well, it's not really steaming, right? Oh, the svedana in Ayurveda is really making the body sweat, and there are various procedures for making that happen, right? You're heating the body from, to make it then sweat, and I think that's the parallel that the alchemical texts are getting at, because the thing that is supposed to happen is this is a cleansing procedure, right? You're releasing things that are sort of stuck to the material, or you're releasing things that are inside the human body that you want to get rid of, or opening the channels, so I think that's the sort of same idea. So I sort of still stick with steaming, with it not being quite right, I suppose, as a translation. But there is this parallel, rubbing things, steaming them, and then it ends, right? Because then we have things like resurrecting the mercury, or killing the mercury, and we don't really have that parallel in Ayurveda for the human.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to listen to all those things. There's the simple things like oleating, isn't it? Just they give the analogy of oleating. You get a dry stick, so if it's very dry and you bend it, it basically snaps. But once it's oleated and nice and moist, it gets flexibility. So the idea is you oleate the body with ghee prior to make it supple, and then there's no stress on the channels when you're evacuating. You can really blast it out, and there's no there's no pain, there's no dryness. And like you were saying with the steaming, kind of dilating the channels, isn't it? Allowing toxins to be removed. And I mean, I've only done it twice, Panchakarma. And the first time I did it scrupulously to the letter. I had a very good instructor and I did everything perfectly. And it was the best experience in my life. It was incredible. I felt 10 years younger after it. And I was so inspired. The next year I thought, I'll do it again. Only this time I'll just do what I think is the right thing to do, or from what I remembered. And I made myself so ill. I literally took a year, took about maybe even 2 to get my digestive back again. It just totally wrecked me. So it really taught me a great lesson. Doing it wrong can often be as instructive as doing it right, because you get a real understanding about what not to do.
I think there's a real misunderstanding also. And I mean, somebody like you who's actually trained in the field, knows better. But I think Ayurveda has been kind of harmed by the way it's presented in the West as, this holistic, gentle medicine that you can just sort of do at home. And of course, there are so many parts of Ayurveda that kind of suggest, the sort of, the daily regimen and so on, where you just sort of think, okay, I can do that and then I will be healthy or so. But really, this is expert knowledge, sort of it's full on training over many years. So, I would never self-medicate, I think, with Ayurvedic medicines. Always, get a practitioner, fully trained practitioner to help you with these things, because, there's a potency to the medicines. It is natural, but natural is a misleading word, isn't it? Natural doesn't necessarily mean good. Their poisons are natural, so and it's always about the dosage and about what is appropriate for you. Things go wrong easily, and even with doctors accompanying you, but they at least know what to do next, sort of if things go wrong.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the first time it was under good instruction. I had a good teacher, and it was seamless, but just kind of arrogance really. And the second go, thinking I could do it as well. And I thought I remembered enough, but it's just those little things, just feeling the doshas moving slightly the wrong way, and you're thinking, oh, it'll be okay. But really, all you're doing is just completely putting out your digestive fire and wrecking your ability to digest for the next 2 years. But I mean, it taught me a valuable lesson, and I've got a lot of respect for it now. And it's not that I didn't before, but now I have a massive amount of respect for it. I understand more about what I was doing. And it was early days. It was kind of I was younger and I was more
gung-ho about things in general.
More adventurous. I'll be a bit more careful now, but.
I was just thinking, how you were saying about, there's a softness that is achieved through the oleation and so on. And I feel like as one gets older, this sense of brittleness and dryness increases. You do get the sense of breaking more easily than when you were young, because you kind of snap back a bit more easily and so on. So these kind of this image of creating softness in the body in order to be able to take the medicine, so on, just makes more intuitive sense. I think,
Yeah, definitely. When they sort of describe the youth as kind of kapha, it's like that sort of fullness, and then pitta as our productive years, where we sort of put our fire into things and really make sure we get what we want, and then vata is kind of getting ready to the last stage to sort of return to the ether, so the body lightens, dries out, we get slower, we get more time for meditation, and the mind calms, and because we've sort of should have done things or fulfilled our desires, so that last stage is more airy. So
well, I don't know. I mean, calmness is not really the thing that's associated with vata, right? I mean, that's more sort of the nervous quickness and so on. So I think the kapha is important in the old age, at least for mental processes and so on. But I mean, I always think of how when talk with Indian practitioners, and they always diagnose absolutely every single person from outside of India as having trouble with vata. Because of being too busy, too nervous, thinking too much, there's sort of like that. I've heard this diagnosis so often, and it's to do, of course, with our lifestyles as well, because nobody really seems to calm down, it's like work is just always there. There's, not a lot of people who manage to have this sort of non-busy lifestyle. I always cheer people on who manage to settle a little bit, you know, as they grow older or not, you know. I think maybe because now I live in North America, there's a real sort of, maybe, you know, Canada is not as much as the US, but there's this sort of hustle culture in the US, you know, where you're supposed to be working all the time.
Yeah.
Effort, you know, like you never stop. You know, a lot of my colleagues are like in their 70s and they're not retiring, you know, because you have to work and you have to produce and be active, you know. And I was just sort of thinking of how un-Ayurvedic that is, you know. Time to withdraw, take it easy, you know. And yeah, there's a sort of culturally, yeah, something different developed here that I think is not good for health in the end. Yeah.
I was just thinking in terms of even kind of preparing stuff. You know, I used to be, so 10 years ago, I was much more preparing more stuff. You know, I had more enthusiasm to do it. Now I'm still enthusiastic, but I kind of pick my projects a bit more, you know, and I'll sort of I take longer to do them. And I'm kind of more interested in sort of watching the process rather than trying to get to the end goal. You know, before you, there's that sort of excitement of seeing the finish. Now it's kind of more the journey of making it. So preparing less, but kind of enjoying it more. But I pick carefully what I'm. It's all too easy to get involved in these projects, and some of them, like some of the work we were doing, I mean, literally some of the stuff went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, didn't it? You know, I suppose documenting it as well slows the process down. You know, you've got to take pictures and videos as well. Actually, I'll put a link under here in a minute so people can go and have a look at the videos we prepared, and
Yeah.
I recommend people go and have a look at that as well. It was really fun to do, and it was just kind of changed my whole perspective on the work. You know, it was really good to try and follow a text and try and see what they were describing, and if we could make the same thing happen. So yeah, it was a really exciting time.
I was thinking of how much time passed, and of course it was just, you know, you on your own doing these things, you know. And we know that people in India were doing similar experiments, and they had a whole team and could do things a bit more quickly. But even so, you know, when you read the text, then you don't really have a sense of how much time will pass. Because I mean, you know, maybe it says, you know, grind it finely or something, and then you don't realize that actually means you're going to be grinding it for 3 continuous days, you know, or, you know, or just, you know, getting the boiling it, or so that quite a lot of time might pass before you get to this material. That was really fascinating for me as well. Also, just seeing from the text, you read a recipe and at first reading it sounds straightforward. Like I remember you and me going through, you know, these 13 verses of the Rasa Tantra, that 10th century alchemical work, and kind of going like, and you were sort of saying, oh yeah, that sounds, yeah, I know how to do that. I'll just do that. Right? And then, you know, 8 months later, you know, like,
Yeah.
wait, but
maybe this wasn't the right way to do it.
But there was always like, you know, immediately then when you actually do the thing, then suddenly all these questions come up, you know, is that the right material really? You know, I remember we had the word for mustard was in there, right? And then we had this discussion, you know, what of mustard? You know, mustard seed, mustard leaf. And we were asking around, and various people, you know, Rasa Shastra practitioners gave us different answers. And I think we went with leaf. So fresh mustard. And then later somebody said, no, it should have been seed. You know, we had no way of knowing, right? We just had the word mustard in the text. So, you know, it's sort of like, okay, is this even right? And then sometimes, you know, how much time needs to pass when you're boiling or steaming something and so on, you know. So it's a certain amount of guesswork. And so these sort of gaps in the text, you know, they weren't really so apparent to me beforehand, and certainly not the amount of time that would pass to sort of do this thing. You know, you read like 13 verses and what do you know, I think, oh, a week's work or something, you know, you can't really grasp it. And so for me, this then brought up this whole question, you know, what was the text used for?
Yeah.
You know, so we have 13 verses, right? Yeah. So why are they writing this down? Because you can't really use it as a DIY manual, or, you know, it looked okay what you were doing, but we had no way of testing it because this was for the mercurial elixir, right? So who knows, you know, was it right? Was it not right? From internet reactions, we got it all wrong. But
all wrong. It's no good, sir. You've got it all wrong.
Yeah, but we didn't really have a way of knowing, right, from just using the text, right? And so, you know, if it's not a teaching device, somebody, you know, should be doing it according to that text. You know, would a teacher have used it as a sort of, something to help their students along with? Would the students have read this? Or is there some other purpose, and in reading that work, and specifically that work, the Rasa Tantra, I came to the conclusion that this was not meant to be a prescription for how to do it. This was just supposed to be a description of what Rasa Shastra is, basically defining the work, right? Giving a sort of sketch of what is supposed to happen, but not really giving all the details and so on, just sort of giving a general overview over the thing. And that this text was actually used to establish Rasa Shastra or Rasa Vada as an authoritative discipline. Yeah. So I think that's what that text was, and then later texts, I think, were in circulation in different ways, especially when it becomes more medical. Then I think it was really used for the training of students and so on. But these early texts, I think, really had a different function. They're really putting alchemy on the map, as it were, rather than telling us how to do it. I would never have thought that if I was just reading it and translating it. I really needed you to go through those 8 months.
Well, it was kind of a collaborative. I mean, I remember when we read through the 8 samskaras first of all, and I thought, this isn't that bad. I think I could do this. And then after we completed all that and realized what a big work that was, what a massive amount of effort it was. And then we looked at the further, because there's 18 samskaras to complete. And I think I've read those other sort of 10 steps or 9 steps, because the last one is actually the taking, isn't it? So, and I still can't make head or tail. I really struggle to visualize what that would look like. I mean, I've got ideas, but like you say, I don't know that that's right unless I actually saw somebody else doing it. And of course, I've never seen. Maybe there's a video online of somebody doing all 18, or did they only do the first 8? I can't remember. There is a video circulating, isn't there?
I've never seen anything beyond the 8th one. No. Also, the lists are different. Like the Rasa Tantra, the next step would be the sort of incorporation of mica. And that's kind of different in some of the other texts. So then you have like this massive chapter on using mica and incorporating it, but you first have to process mica on its own. So there's like loads of extra steps before you do the actual step that is related to the mercurial elixir. And we stopped there. And I also translated, the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara, the jewel mine light on Mercury, the 16th century text, just because it had all sanskaras in one chapter, right. and we were looking at that and saying, well, could we sort of pick up from, step 8 and just continue with that? But then the ingredients got sort of odd, I mean, for us, of course, being in Dorset and sourcing ingredients that are, belong to the Indian subcontinent was always going to be a challenge. But, then it was things like, if you remember, it was buffalo earwax.
Which I actually managed to get, which really surprised me.
Yes, I remember you were so great with
that was really funny. The farmer said, I've actually got it, here it is, and he held out a little, and I said, well, there's not very much. He said, well, how much do you need? And I said, well, a good handful of it. He said, oh my God. He said,
I mean, he must have thought you so odd. I mean, picking up the cow pats for fuel, getting the cow urine, these are just things that don't usually happen, I'm guessing, at least in the UK. I mean, I don't know exactly how people did things in India. Cow pats, of course, are just, normal fuel there in village settings and so on. But yeah, I guess some of the ingredients, I mean, if you have like termite hill earth or something, very easy to source in India, not very easy to source in the UK. So many ingredients that, where I sort of thinking these are weird ingredients, but they kind of make sense in an Indian surrounding. But some of the things that we were looking at in the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara, I think even in an Indian setting would have been a bit of a challenge, crow's feces and so on. Not impossible, but, bit of a challenge for sure. And you sort of, or I got the sense, that this was meant to make it look hard, sort of. I don't even know that they were in fact needed, chemically needed or so, but there's a certain like stay away factor, the way the recipes are described.
There was one, I forget which book it's in now, it talks about the Bunaga, the earthworms, extracting copper from earthworms. And I actually managed to get, about a year ago, got some, a bag of, it was from Hong Kong, but it was from another recipe, but it was earthworm skin. So I actually prepared all those and did the preparation. And when I burnt it and followed that procedure, I did end up with something that looked a bit coppery.
Yeah.
But I haven't got around to testing it, and I don't for a minute suspect that it's copper. But
Oh, I do. I think it's very likely to be copper. You know, I do. Even, yes, I mean, of course, when the earthworms, you know, there's minerals in there. I wouldn't doubt it. You know, just the question is, you know, is it worth your while, you know, to go through the procedures to get, you know, a small amount or so, you know, if you know, so yeah, I think that a lot of things do work, you know, and they knew how to handle things. You know, I mean, the whole idea of an elixir of immortality, you know, that's a leap of faith that I wouldn't take. But you know, certainly ways of manipulating metals, you know, iron tonic recipes and so on. I think, you know, that makes a lot of sense to me, that it would work the way they were doing it.
But yeah, it's a big field, and there are a lot of materials out there, and it would be a headache for anybody to. It's not something that would easily be replicated in the West. Like, you wouldn't even be allowed to.
Yeah, you wouldn't be allowed to. And a lot of the things like orpiment, so the arsenic sulfides and so on. Yeah, I was just thinking about how a lot of the materials could actually be sourced through sort of gardening centers. Rat feces and earthworm cast and so on. These are actually, you know, things that we could buy there in a, you know, in a sort of gardening center. But yeah, other things, yeah, I mean, orpiment and realgar. So these mercury sulfides that become a very normal ingredient, you know, and then, you know, lead. You don't really want heavy metals in something that a human will consume. So, you know, these materials, they're very, you know, it's not really something that you want to play around with. So, you know, they have very well established historical uses, but, you know, it's not something that you DIY at home.
No. And maybe I was just going to say, just for comparison, like the sort of Chinese alchemy, I've looked a little bit into that work, and it's almost a sort of a complete identical material list. It's the same kind of things again, only this time the processing is very, very simplistic. There doesn't seem to be any of that protracted sort of in detailed. So they'll say take something like chalcopyrite and you literally just heat it till it's red hot, quench it into vinegar, powder it, and then, you know, and the doses are quite high as well. So that was interesting, looking at that for a comparative system. Is that something that you've kind of looked at a little bit, or?
A little bit, but I, you know, from what I can see, there's not a lot of translations of the Chinese works, of the ones that deal with the actual substances. You know, Fabrizio Pregadio has worked a lot on the sort of internalized alchemy. So these are sort of meditation practices, essentially using the metaphors of the physical practice. But the you know, works like, there's a translation of one of the early alchemists, Gehong, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right.
Yeah,
you know?
there's various different, yeah.
So there you have these recipes where you have mercury and you have sulfur and you have things, and then you basically you have sublimation and so on. So and it's not exactly the same ingredients, but there is certainly overlap with the Indian materials. So I mean, for the Indian tradition, you know, this whole idea of why mercury is, you know, it's an open question, because there's not really any mercury on the Indian subcontinent, had to be imported. So in a sense, you know, it's kind of weird that it, you know, that became the central ingredient. So I think, you know, this to me means that it's an imported idea. You know, if it's a material that comes from the outside, then, you know, it's sort of not an indigenous tradition, but it became indigenous, right? And, you know, there's stories, especially in the south of India, the Tamil speaking region, where, you know, there's always stories about, you know, there being harvesting of this mercury. Maybe there were sources that, just not big ones or so, you know, enough for the purposes of alchemy, wouldn't be enough for other things. And nowadays there's no mercury anywhere really. I mean, Uzbekistan basically is the supplier. Was, I don't know, now with the Minamata Convention, certainly the trade with mercury must have, I don't know if it's stopped yet, but, you know, there shouldn't be a lot of it around anymore. So I don't know what people do now for mercury. But yeah, so I think that it's quite likely that there was inspiration from the Chinese, maybe via, you know, the Buddhists talking with each other. But, you know, then the Chinese kind of stop using mercury and so on, and they stop that in the Tang dynasty. And when is that, 7th, 8th century? So before the Indian one actually is
It's almost like
established.
one petered off and then the other one kind of started again, you know.
Exactly. So they then instead have this sort of internal alchemy, and then they reintroduce the use of mercury later again, and that's kind of connected with syphilis, you know, and syphilis treatments. And you know, so, but you know, the Chinese had a lot of experience with people actually dying when taking the elixir, so that we have lots of stories of, you know, basically emperors trying to take this elixir of immortality and then dying. I think it's almost like a common theme. You know, I think in Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China or something like that, there are 2 or 3 books actually that are about chemistry, and they deal with the alchemical tradition, and they sort of like give all the examples of where there's, you know, textual evidence for, you know, emperors having taken elixirs and then dying, or emperors deciding that, you know, prisoners would take the elixirs to see what happens, and then all the prisoners dying and so on. So, you know, so there's, you know, they had really good reason to stop what they were doing until, you know, syphilis comes in, and then, you know, everybody worldwide was in a panic of what to do with this illness, how to deal with it. And then the sort of global solution was use mercury in different ways. And so the Chinese did, the Indians did, you know, everybody in Europe did, and so on, with mixed results, I would say.
I know
So
you've
with the
done, there's a
Chinese,
talk I'll put a link to, you've actually done a talk specifically addressing that, haven't you?
yeah. So when I worked in Zurich, at Zurich University, I hosted a whole workshop on the uses of mercury in medicine across Asia. And so I was talking about the Indian case, and I was, you know, specifically focusing on syphilis, but so were many of the others who were working on this field. So we're looking at Tibetan medicine, Arabic medicine, Chinese medicine, Japanese medicine, and so on. So it's actually, so I recorded all of these talks, and except for the one on Chinese medicine given by Ulrike Unschuld, and she said she didn't want that talk to be published, so I didn't, but the others are all in a playlist there. So I think it's something like Fluid Economies of something and something, sorry, it's a few years back now. And the other person who was also doing a lot of work on this was Barbara Gerke, and she had hosted a workshop in Berlin also. And so both her workshop and my workshop, we both published edited volumes on the basis of these talks.
Yeah.
And so hers was published in the journal Asian Medicine. It's a special issue of Asian Medicine. And mine was an online publication with the university, and then and with De Gruyter. And then also it got published in India again. So then it's a physical book. So
yeah, I'll share the covers. I'll put those up as well so people can see that work.
Yeah, but it's open access. So if you don't want to buy a book, you know, you can just find all those articles online. And I think Barbara's volume, because it's an Asian medicine is not open access, but some, you know, if some years pass, then some of the things you can access online without having to pay a fee. So it's worth having a look back. I think hers dates to 2015, or, you know, or, you know, it's sort of between 2012 and 2015 or so, both of those volumes.
Okay. Yeah. I'll point people to those and they can have a look as well. Yeah. It's all great. I mean, it's just amazing that you're doing all this stuff. It's incredible.
You know, as I think back now, you know, these sort of decades passing doing this work, you know, I think this was in the 2010s, you know, sort of like, you know, it is just takes a long time to do these things, you know, because this textual work is slow. You know, it takes a lot of work with the alchemical texts. We don't necessarily have print editions, or you can't rely on them. You know, if you look at manuscripts, they're not easily legible and so on. So, you know, even to just, you know, you don't do a quick translation, right? It takes a lot of thought, a lot of reading, and, you know, going back, you know, having done some translations and then having read a lot more, you know, years later, coming back and looking again at that translation, thinking, I didn't really understand that at the time. Now I know more and can say that actually this technical term means something different and so on. You know, it really takes time to understand. It's a whole worldview. So, you know, it's slow work.
Well, it's a sort of alchemy in itself, really, isn't it? I mean, taking those texts apart and trying to translate and then just bring out the essence of it. It's sort of very alchemical in itself, isn't it? You know, I'm sort of working with the materials, the sort of the physical world. You're doing all the textual stuff. It's a kind of similar kind of action.
I still enjoy your outcomes. You know, when we were doing these experiments where it was from a later text and it wasn't about mercurial elixirs, but it was about sort of making jewels, making pearls, making rubies and so on. I was just thinking of how you really have a knack for doing these physical things, because, I was trying to do the ruby one, because I thought, okay, I can do the ingredients and I'll try it myself, and I failed miserably, and yours turned out very nice. So I think, there's real skill in these physical activities that you need to train and sort of, you get better at.
It's definitely a skill. I mean, like, even now, after all these years, I still mess up medicated oils every now and then. There's a procedure, and if you just stray from it, it's ruined. And every time you sort of hit yourself thinking, why did I do that? Because you were just trying to save 5 or 10 minutes and it ended up costing you the remedy. But that's the art of it, that you just have to be structured, and which I'm actually not by nature. So it's a good discipline for me to actually sit down and try and do it structurally. So that's why I've kind of gone into that. That's not my background at all. I mean, I just wandered into Ayurveda a little bit like yourself, and then ended up in Sri Lanka. And then I didn't go there to study that. I just happened to find somebody that was willing to teach. And then, so in a way, we've all sort of drifted into these super niche fields, like the niche of the niche, isn't it? I'm a little bit conscious of your time. I know you've got to get back. You've got students to teach. So just in wrapping up, is there anything, if people want to get hold of you, or, I mean, are you even available for say more talks or your work, or, how do people find out more about what you're doing? Have you?
Well, I think the Ayurveda website is a really good place to look at sort of the things that we created, and there's a lot of material on there just to sort of see what I've been working on. I have an academia.edu website where I put on all my open access publications, so if anybody wants to read up on things there. At the moment, I'm not giving a lot of public talks. I am doing a few here and there, but I'm sort of slightly consumed with my teaching at the university and the administrative work that I have to do there. Next year, I'm going on sabbatical starting in January 2025, and I will get back to doing more research. And I hope that will be, that will bear fruit, and there will be more coming forward from me. And, I'm still sort of thinking of, could I start a new big project on alchemy, and sort of hope maybe to start something like that. But it's just right now, it's a slightly quieter time for me. But, if people look at the Ayurveda website, that's, always a good starting point.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you giving up your time to do this. And it's been great. So thank you again. And see you soon.
Yeah, and I hope one day we'll do another project with each other. It's been so much fun working with you.
Me too. Okay. You take care. Thank you very much.
Okay.